Welcome everyone to the CCPO-ICAR Spring 2025 virtual seminar series. I'm very pleased to welcome Matt Reidenbach for presenting today on creating resilient futures, building social, natural, and physical capitals in coastal communities. I wanted to just give you a quick introduction. So Matt Reidenbach is a professor and chair of the Department of Environmental Sciences at the University of Virginia. His primary research area is coastal oceanography, with an emphasis on how hydrodynamics impact marine organisms and their ecosystems. His current research includes the effects of flow and turbulence on nutrient exchange in coral reefs, larval transport in estuaries, chemical dispersion in the ocean, and wave dynamics. He also studies coastal resilience and nature-based solutions for coastal protection. We'll wait until the end for questions. So Matt, go ahead.
Great. All right. Thank you, Dominion University. It's nice, in the state of Virginia, there's good collaborations with the different universities there. And so it's also thankful because some of the work that I'll be talking about today is this project that I have ongoing with some other folks, both at UVA, but other institutions in Virginia, as well as nonprofits down in Norfolk through the Coastlines and People program of the National Science Foundation, where we're really looking at the impacts of coastal urban flooding and using Norfolk as really the test case for a lot of the questions that we're asking about how to engage communities in planning for coastal urban flooding. How do we not only prepare the local communities, but how do we engage with the local governments as well as plan for kind of future scenarios and how we might create these resilient futures in both sort of the building by building, the social capital, natural capitals, as well as sort of the built infrastructure that can really help for a resilient future in these flood-prone areas. And so all of us probably know, that we have a lot of diverse Virginia coastal communities. And, we go from these highly urbanized systems like Virginia Beach and Norfolk to kind of these much more rural systems, say on the eastern shore of Virginia. How we address climate change and storm impacts and sea level rise and coastal flooding is probably different depending on how much density of population there is, what the natural ecosystem looks like, and how much humans have actually altered these systems. And so what I'd like to do in my talk is kind of focus on both of these systems. We have this project that's going on in Norfolk looking at these urban resilient systems, but for many years I've been working in the eastern shore of Virginia, where we have a marine lab that focuses on more natural ecosystems and climate change impacts on these natural ecosystems and how it might affect more rural communities. So I'll focus my talk on both of these communities and how addressing issues in one, how they're similar and different depending on these urban and rural natural systems. Okay. And so many of you, or probably all of you in Norfolk, sort of understand these, in real life dynamics about how these impacts of changing climates are and intersecting with human activity are really altering how we live, work, play, and function in these environments. We have this combination of, say, sea level rise that's occurring with storms that cause both impacts due to storm surge, but then also human alterations of the environment make it much more difficult for, say, these natural ecosystems to buffer these changes. And so how do we create these built environments such as Norfolk that can be adaptable and take into account these changes that we're expected to see over the next coming decades to mitigate the impacts of these rising sea levels, these intensifying storm events, as well as planning for future built environments in these regions. So just to start with, if we think about sea level rise and its impact, it's not, it's pretty well known now that, we have a lot of these very low-lying regions along the Atlantic, mid-Atlantic region. And Norfolk is one of these that, if you look at the elevation, the vast majority of, say, Norfolk, as well as the Chesapeake Bay region and the coastal systems, are only a couple meters above sea level. And so as we continue to have relative sea level rise, this is going to start to impact more and more the flooding and how we might see coastal erosion. So if we look at the both longer term trends and sort of trajectories of sea level rise. We're right now about at 5.5 millimeters per year in the mid-Atlantic region. And this is actually larger than kind of the global average of 3.5 millimeters per year. And it has to do with this land subsidence due to glacial rebound and other factors that make the mid-Atlantic region, right, have statistically higher rates of sea level rise compared to global averages. And because of that, then that impacts kind of where we might start to see flooding. This is coupled with kind of the major hurricane tracks that we see moving through the Virginia region, right? So all of you who have lived in Norfolk and Virginia for a number of years know that we see pretty significant storms, on a yearly basis, and then we get, really hit with these kind of major storms periodically. If we kind of measure the intensification of some of these storms, we see statistical increasing impacts of kind of the magnitude of the wind events, coupled with sea level rise, are going to really start impacting flood risk, especially in these low-lying urban areas. And so on the right side, I've plotted out the 100-year flood zone in Norfolk, and pretty substantial amount of the city of Norfolk is in these 100-year flood zones. In many instances, in many locations around the United States, you're not allowed to build in these 100-year flood zones. And we start to see that the city of Norfolk, a huge fraction of that city is kind of in those flood zone regions. And so how do we actually taking this into account, knowing that these flood risks are going to increase over time, the intensity of the storms are going to increase over time, and the cost to construction and the cost to communities, both in the health and well-being of these communities, are going to be impacted by this. And so this is where, in many ways, one of the large aspects of this National Science Foundation funded Coastlines and People grant is really focusing on. And so for this project, our objective is really to advance transferable methods that urban communities can use to engage in the climate resilience challenge. And so the idea there is we want to not only understand the historical aspects of flooding, but then use hydrologic modeling and other computational modeling to understand future impacts on flooding in these urban watersheds. And as we understand where we're going to be in the next 10, 20, 30 years, try to co-design with local communities infrastructure investments to understand how we can actually construct new roads, bridges, buildings, taking into account that this flooding is going to be more persistent in these areas. And then another aspect of this project is how do we propose doing this that is equitable and fair for the very diverse communities that we see, not only in Norfolk, but then try to apply these ideas and technologies and understanding to these other kind of coastal communities facing similar flooding challenges. So the way that we've addressed this is that through this project, we have a number of partners and stakeholders. And so the primary kind of, I would say, scientific educational aims of the project are really spearheaded by University of Virginia. So I'm in the Department of Environmental Sciences, but the lead of the project is in civil and environmental engineering, John Goodall. So we have a number of faculty at UVA, including people in the landscape architecture department, as well as other humanities departments. And then we also have teamed up with faculty at Norfolk State University to do a lot of this work. In addition to kind of the educational aims through universities, we have also teamed up with the Elizabeth River Project, which is a local nonprofit, which I'm probably many of you have heard of down in the Norfolk region. But we also have community members. And so community liaisons throughout the city. And just to highlight one of them is Kim Sutterth, who's been really integral part of kind of interfacing the local community and these local neighborhoods and the community members in these local neighborhoods with our project by having these local partners on the project as well. And lastly, a lot of this work, if we really want to affect change, has to incorporate the local city government. So we've also, as part of the project, have the Office of Resilience and Utilities and Stormwater Management for the city of Norfolk, who is playing a large role in sort of providing the data to run our simulations, to help us kind of engage with the local communities, but then also plan for how we can actually do construction projects, stormwater abatement projects throughout the city, and highlight kind of regions where we can actually address some of these ongoing issues in these regions. So this is ultimately a fairly large project, and I won't go into all the small details, but we've really kind of broken this up to the watershed scale in Norfolk. And so if you think about the watersheds, right, there's a lot of different watershed regions in Norfolk that kind of both are flooded and drain over these different land areas. And so we've tried to address this through um, multiple tasks that we have going on that address the regional scale. So how does interactions between precipitation, sea level rise, and storm surge interact to cause flooding in a lot of these areas? But then also have this interaction between kind of the science components of the project as well as the community scale projects. So working with communities to do community engagement, to do co-design of how we can actually do flood abatement projects, looking at kind of these co-benefits assessments of these projects that we might try to apply. And as we probably all know, in many ways, there's been a big disconnect between kind of the planning and the construction and the urban city government, and then actually engagement with the communities and what the community members might actually want to see. And so, but there's also feedback. A lot of times the community members, obviously don't want the flooding, but they don't know the engineering components that might be involved with sort of making sure that that happens. And so trying to figure out kind of this framework for which the community members can engage with the engineers, can engage with the local city government to have that kind of co-design process be at play as one of the main aspects of our project here. So I'll try to focus on the research that I do. So I don't do all of that stuff. My background is in civil engineering, and I do hydrology, hydrodynamics, and focus on coastal fluids. So I look at wave dynamics, coastal storms, turbulence, sediment transport. And so in many instances, right, there's this coupling that happens where we have flooding in these coastal urban areas that are due to, say, rising sea levels and storm surge that bring water from the ocean onto the land. But oftentimes, right, we also have flooding that's due to heavy precipitation events. And sometimes these are coupled and they're occurring at the same time. Sometimes, right, the precipitation might come a day or two before the major storm surge. And so when you incorporate both sort of the flooding due to the storm surge and precipitation, this causes, heightened impacts. But oftentimes our ability to predict these are very separate. We have these land-based models that then predict how flooding might occur. And then we have these ocean-based storm surge models that predict how flooding might occur, but they don't often talk to one another. And oftentimes that leads to errors when you have sort of storm surge and heavy precipitation co-occurring. So part of the goal is to kind of develop pretty high level models for both of these systems and then actually be able to integrate them to attempt to try to start to get to real-time, near real-time flood prediction, and then use that information to kind of make long-term trajectories. So I don't want to go into some of this gory details, but oftentimes, right, you need to know kind of aspects of storm surge events and what the return periods are for these different levels, as well as the magnitude and return probability of precipitation, but also figure out kind of that co-occurrence of them. Do you get storm surge at the same time as precipitation? And so if you have a 100-year flood caused by precipitation, is that, what does that relate to in terms of the 100-year flood due to storm surge? And are they happening at the same time or not? So we've, a lot of the work is to go through the historical record of precipitation as well as storm surge, and then look at kind of where we start to see peak flooding and really kind of try to both decouple these, but then also couple them in our hydrologic models. So I first want to start off with just briefly talking about kind of the surface hydrology models that we've been using. And I say models because it turns out that, different models work better at, addressing certain projects. And so this aspect of the kind of the surface hydrology is being done in the Civil Engineering Department of Virginia. And they're using this model called 2Flow, which basically looks at various elevation, land cover, soil types to try to integrate all these things to understand how the surface and near surface hydrology might work in these kind of urban systems. So, right, if you obviously have more pavement, water's going to run off the surface versus you have more green space, that water's going to go into the near subsurface, and then how that water is transmitted through these areas. Coupled to this, then you have these pipe networks and drainage networks that then will be able to transfer water from interior urban areas outwards. So these models work, but then essentially at the boundaries, you have the ocean. And so if you have storm surge at the ocean, that's actually forcing water inland. And this is often why in Norfolk, you have actually this inland flooding events that occur. So even though it's raining pretty heavily and you might have dry areas, you actually have regions that are flooding interior because at certain locations, right, the storm surge is blocking the drainage outlets that's preventing that water from leaving the city streets. You might even have backfilling in these areas caused by ocean water going up into these drainage systems. Obviously, the city of Norfolk knows this and they try to kind of correct for this, but we can, by using modeling and some pretty good information about the pipe network, soil type, elevation, we can get a better handle on as storm surge and precipitation co-varies, how is that going to cause flooding in different parts of the city? Okay. Now, my aspect of the project is really looking at kind of the storm surge, since I'm kind of more of an ocean-based person. And so one of the ideas there is we want to be able to understand kind of the factors that play a role in flooding in Norfolk. So as we all know, when hurricanes hit, oftentimes the magnitude of the storm surge that might be affecting Norfolk or different regions really has to do with both the magnitude and direction of the winds that are driving these storms. That is really one of the main drivers of the storm surge, whereas the amount of precipitation is really impacting kind of the land-based amount of flooding. And so one of the ways that we're trying to get at the storm surge or how that's impacting the tide elevations or the tidal elevations of the water along the coastline is to use this, what's called this advanced circulation model. So it turns out, right, if you want to do good modeling or prediction of storm surge along coastal systems, you need to predict or have a good estimate of the wind field over really large areas in order to be able to do a good prediction of what that storm surge is going to be. So in order to generate one of these models that's actually good at predicting storm impacts is that you actually have to have a computational grid that's pretty large. So the AdCirc model, if you can see here, it's almost hard to pick out, but we have sort of Florida down here, Atlantic. And so this model that we're running has a model domain that goes all the way up from Canada, all the way down to South America. See Gulf of Mexico in here. And so all of these regions we have to actually model both the ocean currents as well as the sea level state in order to get good predictions of how these large hurricane tracks are actually impacting storm surge. And so because of that, then, if you delve down in, we actually have some pretty good resolution using this model of the Chesapeake Bay region. And so we're actually using this model not only for the Norfolk Chesapeake Bay region, but also looking at flooding impacts on the eastern shore of Virginia. And so this model, is not super high resolved in the open ocean, but as we get into the coastal systems, we're down around 100 to 200 meter grid resolution. So still not ideal. And oftentimes what we do is we use this AdCirc model to get kind of general sea level storm surge, but we might use other models if we really are interested in the flow patterns or the wave patterns in, say, the Chesapeake Bay or the coastal ocean. So one of the ways we want to do this is to kind of simulate the historical storms to make sure that this model is very well calibrated and validated. And then we can use this to start predicting future storm scenarios. What do we expect these storms to look like in 10 or 20 years? Or even if we have a hurricane track that's moving, can we use this to maybe get a day or two, run this model to actually predict what the storm surge might look like in a day or two as this hurricane progresses, if we can get the sort of the speed of this model to run as fast as possible. So what we've done is we've taken this large model and then simulated these historical storm events to actually look to see how well we can calibrate and validate this model. Because the wind patterns matter so much in terms of what that's going to drive storm surge, this model actually has to have a coupling between the winds and the ocean. So we not only need to know kind of the hydrodynamics of the ocean currents and the sea level rise, but we actually need to predict the wind patterns over that model domain pretty accurately. So a lot of the work that we've been doing is trying to get really accurate wind fields for these hurricane tracks, and we often use multiple data sets, including real-time data as well as atmospheric models to regenerate the wind fields over different storms. And so just to, I'm not going to go in the details too much, but say if we take Hurricane Florence, we have multiple different atmospheric models that are telling us, you know, consistent but slightly different wind tracks. And so we try to take both averages as well as variations in these different fields to actually come up with one composite wind field that will drive our ocean model and then predict the storm surge that occurs from these wind patterns that we actually see. So once we have that, then we can actually compare these model runs once they're calibrated and try to validate them using comparisons to actual meteorological stations and tide gauging stations. And so if we look at just the mouth or the inlet of the Chesapeake Bay, luckily it's pretty well instrumented. And so each one of these two-letter acronyms, we have data on tidal elevations. At the meteorological stations, we have tide information as well as wind information. So we can really compare model output to actual data. And if we zoom in even further, the region of Norfolk and especially Elizabeth River is the area that we're really interested in and doing a really good ability to predict storm surge, tide elevations during these major storm events to then understand how that storm surge is going to cause flooding and then how we can actually use those storm surge models to interface with the land-based terrestrial hydrologic models to then do a really good job of predicting locations of flooding in these urban regions. And so I had a postdoc who did a lot of work developing this model, calibrating it and validating it. And it's actually, it's pretty amazing how accurate it is. Those who do hydrologic modeling, you hope to get close, but, there's always going to be a little bit of errors. But just to kind of highlight this model validation for, say, a storm in 2009, once it's calibrated, this validation is sort of separate. And if we can actually, the nice thing is that we can run the model where these red lines are essentially the tide gauges from NOAA. So those are the real actual tide elevations. And you can kind of see as this hurricane passed over, we have these tidal fluctuations on these semi-diurnal tides. And then we have that storm surge that, say, right around November 13th, raise the water levels by, close to a meter and a half during that storm. Now, the model, the AdCirc model, if you just run tidal components without any wind, you can actually create this kind of teal color of the tidal variations. And so without any winds, this is the predicted water levels at this sewer point here, the station here, called SP. And then down here, this lower one, MP, is sort of this tide gauge station that's further up the river. Now, once you add the winds from these storms, from these atmospheric models, you actually get the combined AdCirc model that's in the dark blue, and you can almost not see it because it almost does almost a perfect recreation of the actual tidal measurements that we had due to the NOAA tide gauges. And so it's doing an amazing job of predicting kind of the expected tides, meaning that it's doing well in terms of not only getting the drag parameterization of these models, but also the drag of the ocean surface for the wind stress to create that storm surge. And so then we can figure out these dotted black lines and what the actual storm surge was for these models. You can actually see here, right, during peak storm events, there was about 1.6 meters of storm surge. So once we have these, then we can actually recreate a lot of the flooding that was occurring in Norfolk and through the Elizabeth River for these various storm events. And so just to highlight some of them, we have these different storms for, say, Isabel and Norida, Sandy and Joaquin, to look at these storm surge that, in many of these over 2 meters of storm surge due to these storms, especially, say, Hurricane Isabel came through, and you see these greens and yellows that are right around 2 meters of storm surge. Pretty high levels of water that's going to cause a lot of flooding inland. So you might say, okay, well, what's the benefit of these models if we're just predicting historical trends? Well, the goal of these models is now to use this to kind of predict future scenarios of flooding in the Norfolk region. And so what we've done is looking at a historical analysis of flooding and storm surge due to different changes in sea level rise and storminess. And so if you actually look at the historical record, right, sea level rise has been increasing at a rate of, here on this data, 5.52 millimeters per year. But also, what's happening too is that if we actually look at the wind speeds during these storm events and you look at the maximum wind speeds, the wind speeds have also been increasing. And so if we look at, say, a future scenario given current conditions, sea level should rise about 0.2 meters in a 40-year period, and the wind speed should also increase by about a 10% rate over that 40-year period. So the storms are getting more intense with higher winds. Sea level is higher. This is going to, the expectation is that this storm surge is going to get worse and worse as we go through the decades. And so you can now use these models to say, okay, Hurricane Isabel occurred in 2003. If that same storm happened in 2043 with 0.2 meters of sea level rise and winds that were increased by 10%, what should the flooding look like? And so we can use these models to predict flooding. And so we can actually see then, if Isabel occurred, and this was our model of the 2003 storm, where we would have kind of peak storm surge around 2 meters. In 40 years, that same storm is going to have peak water levels more about 3 meters above mean levels. And so even though there's only a 20 centimeter rise in sea level, the storm surge is going to be about a meter due to the coupling of both deeper water depths, right, that causes less friction to cause storm surge to build up, combined with those increased wind patterns. We're actually going to start to see really accelerated levels of storm surge over the next couple of years. It's not just going to be 20 centimeters. It's going to be closer to a meter in 40 years due to these storm events. So we can still see, right, these enhanced impacts of kind of these climate change scenarios kind of really impacting kind of future flooding events, especially in this Norfolk region. And we run these for a bunch of different ones. And now the goal is then to couple these future scenarios of storm surge with these land-based models. And so here's where it gets a little messy, which I won't go into all the details, but we use this two-flow model to look at kind of the land structure and land cover and impermeable surfaces and soil type to look at kind of water as it ponds and drains. And then we have this other model called PC-SWIM, which is an EPA model called a stormwater management model that really looks at the pipe networks and sort of how water is draining through the culverts, pipes for the stormwater drains. And then by using this, we can actually really look at, on a neighborhood scale, where we expect to see flooding under these different storm events. And so this is also work by John Goodall's group that really is taking our model simulations of predicted storms and then applying it to these areas to say, okay, this region, might flood once a year. In 40 years, you're going to probably see flooding 5 or 6 times a year. Or, this area won't see flooding now, but in about 10 to 20 years, the expectation is these are going to be also pretty high flood prone regions. So we have this, right? And then you say, okay, well, this is great information. How do we actually use this to actually affect change in how we make decisions in our local communities? And this is really where the second part of this community engagement aspect starts to really take a role. So we partner with, Sharon Sharon Alston, who's works with us, who's down at Norfolk State University, is running a lot of these community meetings. And so every few months, we go into the local communities and have these workshops where we talk about kind of future flooding scenarios. We bring the maps, and what we found is, in many ways, science communication, just having kind of paper maps where we draw on these maps about where flooding is going to occur, where it's not going to occur, find where people's houses are, so we can really kind of engage the local community about where, what the future impacts are going to be and how we might mitigate these issues. And so in many instances, right, a local city member might not have a huge say in whether a culvert or a pipe network gets built, but um, part of these community meetings is to kind of highlight some of the things that both local communities can do, local landowners can do to actually mitigate some of these flooding problems. And so part of the community engagement is to kind of bring up these kind of landscape architecture features that can potentially be instituted into these local neighborhoods. Bioretention cells and swales that impact infiltration. Even the way we do construction in terms of planters and roadside gardens, green roofs, permeable pavements, and talk to community members about these various aspects, and then also try to bring in members of the city government who might, have ability to have grant programs to actually give money to local residents to build these things, or work with the local civic league to say, hey, we have these kind of regions that are kind of just an open land area. Maybe we can put in this retention pond in this area or create a green roof on some of these buildings to really kind of alter flooding. And then we can actually incorporate these changes into our models to say, does it have any effect on the local flooding? And oftentimes, right, it's not one green roof or one stormwater planter, but once you start to add more and more, this can have an impact over the next couple of decades on kind of how much the magnitude of flooding might occur in different regions. And so, right, we have these different things that we try to engage with the community. The other thing that we've done is we've tried to engage very heavily with, in many ways, two local communities to actually have test projects go on to see how this community engagement works combined with this modeling, combined with engagement with the local city government to actually create change and build something. And obviously with National Science Foundation grants, there's only so much you can do. So we're trying to kind of target some areas that is, conceivable to do construction in the next 3 to 5 years that we can actually monitor and look at. And so one of the focal areas that we're working on it's called the Debris Paper Street Park. And it's a very small kind of pocket park in the city of Norfolk that really just has kind of grass with some vegetation on it. But it's prone to flooding, and it's also impacting as that water floods in these areas, local homeowners, and then it's also blocking some of these streets. And so what we've been doing is working with the local communities in this area and giving presentations about kind of the flooding, and then what could we do as this park. And so the city of Norfolk is on board with doing construction in this area. And so this is where the landscape architects can come in and say, hey, we can put in tree covers or these rain gardens in this areas. We can also add seating or lighting. And, it's been, in some ways pretty fascinating, as an engineer or kind of an architect, you sort of have this vision of what you want to have happen. But then you go into the local community and they're like, you know what? It's great to have seating, but we actually don't want lighting. Once you put lighting in there, a bunch of teenagers start to hang out till 3 in the morning and it just causes trouble. So we don't want lighting. And, in many ways, you wouldn't even think about these things, right? Or like, different tree cover, might be really nice for some communities, but they might not want it in other communities and so forth. And so we've been working with the local neighbors in this area to try to come up with a plan that then the city, as well as some funding from the Elizabeth River Project, can really enact to kind of put this in place. But it really takes coordination with the local communities and having local community members and local community leaders in place to really engage. And, as many of you probably know at ODU and so forth, universities have had kind of a checkered past with engagement in local citizens and kind of having the citizens feel like they're actually looking out for their interest and not just using them as a data point, and so working with these civic leagues, local community members to really try to, in many ways, build trust in these systems. It turns out to be super important. Has been one of the fascinating, I think, parts of the project about how you do that, how you engage with the community, how you do it well. That's not just kind of superficial so that it just feels like it's going to kind of go nowhere. So, obviously it's a work in progress, but it's been pretty interesting in these aspects. And one of the things that we've actually found was that, a lot of the local community members, some obviously due to different socioeconomic classes have ability to have cars versus have to use public transit. Whereas others, right, they have a much higher proportion of, say, elderly people who have mobility issues, or there might be a couple neighbors that have, other family members with mobility issues. And so really trying to understand how flooding differentially impacts different community members has been also a big part of this project. And this is where some of the work that one of my PhD students has been working on is that once we have these models that predict flooding and the magnitude of flooding, how does this flooding impact the vulnerability of these different communities? And what we focus on is initially is on the mobility impaired. And so what we're addressing here is this idea that there's two different types of flooding, right? There's flood hazard, which is the combination of factors that determine the occurrence and intensity of flooding. But there's also what's flood vulnerability. And so the vulnerability is the combination of factors that influence how intensely a population is actually impacted by that flooding. So oftentimes engineers and scientists love to predict the hazard because then you can do 100-year floods and it's all kind of physical. You can do models. Understanding how it's actually going to affect the populations is going to be is a lot different. So that's where you really need to engage with faculty in social work and geography and demographics of populations to see how this works. So one of the things that we're working on is saying, okay, we can identify hazards and understand what are the mechanisms that might cause flooding. So once we have these flood maps and we see versus various reasons why flooding occurs, we can then ask the question of what's causing this flooding physically, right? This is hazard criteria. So obviously, if you're very close to an active coastal channel, you're going to be much more prone to flooding than if you're kind of away. Similarly, if you're at high elevation, you're going to be less prone to flooding than if you're at low elevation. And so there's multiple factors that play a role in identifying the hazards associated with flooding in Norfolk. Land use obviously impacts how much a certain area would flood. So slope will impact how much an area flood. You take these into account, and then you can actually build up a flood map that is actually pretty complex. And it turns out, not surprisingly for those people who live in Norfolk, that it's not just people who live close to the coastline that are impacted by flooding. It's actually people who live inland that are also impacted by flooding pretty often. And it's actually this kind of interesting mosaic of flood risk. Obviously, near the coast, you have very high hazard class. If you're at high elevation, you have very low, but a lot of times there's these interior regions that also have very high flood hazard risk just due to the kind of combination of these factors of elevation, distance to channels, soil type, vegetation cover, and so forth. So because of this, right, we can take into account all this kind of physical relationships and come up with these flood risk maps. But then what we can do is then say, okay, given these flood risks, can we quantify the differential impact they have onto various communities? And this is where it takes into account, right, if you're mobility impaired, what sort of factors make you vulnerable to flooding? Well, some of that might be if there's not many sidewalks, you are going to have a lot of difficulty getting around in a flood area. If you are mobility impaired and you're far away from emergency response, that's going to give you higher vulnerability than someone who's healthy, right? Person with disability, population age. And so this comes up with census data to look at different demographics in Norfolk. And then we can actually apply these maps and demographic data to look at the vulnerability of different populations. And what I find is kind of fascinating, right, is if you take a look at the risk associated with flooding for these mobility impaired residents of Norfolk, it actually looks different than if you just looked at the vulnerability for the general population. And that's because, right, in some flood prone areas, you have a much higher proportion of mobility impaired people. Other places that might be high flood risk, it's young and mobile and they have no problems, and so we can actually use census data to really target regions in Norfolk where, say, the city government really needs to prioritize emergency response because they have high mobility impaired populations in these regions. And so, in many ways, once you do this, you can start asking some pretty interesting questions about, okay, people who are older, are there higher proportions of, right, low-income populations that don't have cars, and how does that address risk? And there's all these issues with how do you assess the vulnerability and what weights you put on them. And this is where it takes into account kind of glossing over this, but we take into account kind of expert opinions on kind of the impacts of density and the importance of sidewalk density versus distance to emergency response that plays a factor in this. But there's in many ways, there's a lot of work that's going on related to this. And I think that's in many ways kind of interesting. Once you get high detail and sort of flood risk, then you can start to really target kind of how that's affecting different populations. And so because of this, then, right, one of the things that we've realized is you actually need a lot of good real-time data about where flooding is occurring, how often it's occurring, if you really want to understand kind of impacts it's having on, right, the drivers, the local community. And so part of the other aspects of the project is kind of integrating this and then, also enhancing the real-time sensor network system in the city of Norfolk, adding more tide gauges in areas, more rain gauges in others, and oftentimes there's these pretty inexpensive real-time sensor network systems, these what's called low RAN and other ways that these sensor systems communicate to provide some real-time information about tide gauges. And then the goal is to then feed into these models that then can actually start to predict, okay, in 3 or 4 hours, you're going to see flooding on this road, so don't go down there. Or, this big hurricane that's coming, we have a better estimate for where flooding is going to occur in 3 days than we did before to try to really integrate this information. So it's still a work in progress. I would say that we just finished year 1 of the 5-year project. So hopefully we're starting to get the models up and running. We're starting to apply them and stuff like that. So it's still, as I say, a work in progress, but we're kind of making inroads to sort of understanding kind of flood risk and associated flood risk for different communities and how to plan for these futures that we might see in these regions. Okay. All right. So that's sort of the highlight for the urban systems that I've been working on. I'd like to kind of spend a little bit of time kind of switching gears to looking at more rural communities and sort of the impacts that sea level rise, storms, variable ecosystem dynamics might be occurring in these more rural systems and how that might impact kind of these communities that live there. So obviously, right, the city of Norfolk will spend hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, doing flood risk mitigation, building seawalls, armoring areas. That isn't economically feasible for these small communities. And so how do these smaller communities that might have a couple hundred residents deal with flood risk and mitigation of these risk systems? And so we're going to first zoom in, going from, say, Virginia, kind of the Virginia Beach, Norfolk region, and then go on to the eastern shore of Virginia. So this is kind of that strip of land that's separating the Chesapeake Bay from the Atlantic Ocean. And on the eastern side, it's basically barrier islands with these marsh systems. And then we have a bunch of these smaller towns dotting these this coastal landscape. And we're going to focus in on the smaller town of Wachapreak, which is in that region. And so if we do a drone flight over there, you can kind of see the small coastal community of a couple hundred residents. And then offshore of this, we have these very shallow lagoon systems that are incorporating marshes, these tidal channels, that we have some oyster reefs along there. And on the outer coast, as you can kind of see in the background, there's these barrier islands. And it's really these barrier islands that are buffering a lot of the major storm impacts of waves and so forth to these interior. But you also have these open waters that will create waves that will propagate that wave energy to the coastline where these communities live. And then also the barrier islands do protect to a certain amount storm surge, but these water masses can still make it into these barrier islands that raise the water level. And so we have differential impacts of storm surge, waves, precipitation on these smaller coastal communities than we might say have in Norfolk. And so the question then is, how do we address this differently as we kind of plan for future scenarios? But in a similar way that we see these storm surge, I just kind of plot out, this is the dock for our marine lab, which in a town called Oyster, Virginia, which is maybe 30 or 40 miles south of Wachapreak. And just to kind of highlight the storm surge during Hurricane Sandy, you can see this tidal elevation over that 4-day period that rose maybe about 1.5 meters. And, our dock under a nice day on the bottom right, it looks like that. And then during the storm, the entire dock was submerged. All those houses on the outer side of that picture were underwater. Some of those houses were up on stilts. Those that weren't were all flooded. And so, this is, so Hurricane Sandy was a big storm, but, we probably see Hurricane Sandy level storms every few years on the Eastern Shore. So docks that get flooded like this, or are they going to get destroyed, more often and so forth? And so what are the dynamics that are at play in these more rural systems that might impact that? And if you actually go to the Eastern Shore, it's a really fascinating landscape. It's very flat. It's composed of primarily marshes, mud flats, and these intertidal regions, and then offshore these are these barrier islands. And so one of the things we're focusing on are these oysters. And so historically, oysters had about 150 to 100 times greater population than they do nowadays. And that due to a combination of overfishing, disease. The populations of oysters have really declined, but oysters not only cause for food supply for humans, but they actually created this hard, stable substrate that created a complex topography along the coastal landscape that had probably a pretty significant role in offering coastal protection in these systems. So part of our work is coupling tightly with the Nature Conservancy to try to do coastal restoration and oyster restoration to not only enhance oyster populations, but also to quantify whether these oyster reefs have any buffering capacity as a nature-based solution for coastal protection. Now, the oysters on the eastern shore of Virginia on the seaside differ a little bit than the Chesapeake Bay side, that we only really see intertidal oyster reefs on the seaside of the Delmarva Peninsula. So they don't really exist below low water levels. And they actually exist in a fairly tight range on the eastern shore between low water and about mid-tide. Once you get anywhere above mid-tide, they're just out of the water too much to really create large stable populations. And so we see these oyster reefs where when they're submerged, they're underwater at high tide, and then when the tide goes down, they're emergent, and we can kind of see them pretty readily. So one of the big questions that we're doing is, how do you do this restoration? And then how can we quantify its impacts on storm surge, potential flooding on the coastal system? So one of the things that we've been working with is the Nature Conservancy is to build these oyster reefs with the goal of understanding like how you do this effectively to maybe mitigate storm impacts. So we built these oyster reefs using these oyster castles at various elevations in the water column. We've used 3 rows to make greater widths of the oyster reefs versus 1 row, with the goal of enhancing oyster populations, but also mitigating storm impacts on the coastline. And one of the nice things about these restoration projects is there's actually a lot of natural oyster recruitment going on in the coastal system. There's actually a really good natural supply of oyster larvae, and so you actually don't need to do much beyond putting hard, stable substrate for oyster larvae to attach, and then they grow into healthy adult oysters. And so just an example of this, these reefs were constructed in October of 2017. Less than a year later, we have this massive growth of oysters. If you think about the oysters you often buy in the grocery store, those oysters are often maybe a year and a half old. And so they get to market size in a year and a half. And so within 1 year, you actually get pretty good sized oysters. This creates this healthy existing reef. Then the question is, does this have any impact on, say, storm surge or wave impacts on coastal systems? And so we've been monitoring wave attenuation and storm surge impacts across these oyster reefs. And it turns out that oyster reefs do have some ability to dampen wave energy. If you measure, say, wave height on the ocean side versus the protected side, you can quantify the attenuation of the waves by essentially plotting the height of the waves on the bay side on the, say, x-axis, and the height of the waves on the marsh side on the y-axis. The 1-to-1 line means that the wave heights are exactly the same, so there's no attenuation. If you have data points that follow below the 1-to-1 line, that means that the marsh side waves are smaller than the bay side, and there has been some attenuation. It turns out if you build these reefs and they're kind of at the lower limit of elevation, they essentially have zero ability to attenuate waves. And even if you build these reefs higher, they only have any ability to really attenuate waves when water depths are somewhat shallow. So what ends up happening then is During a storm event, when you actually have storm surge, these reefs are submerged pretty deep and they provide essentially no protection to either storm surge or wave attenuation. So it turns out, contrary to what we would hope for, is that oyster reefs don't actually do much for coastal protection on their own. And so, although we'd like to say, oh, we built all these oyster reef systems, they were not really going to do much during storms. However, what we found is that oftentimes these oyster reefs in their natural state are lining marsh areas. And if you look at marsh edges, they're often these areas that are kind of like these coastal mudflat areas, and then the vegetation is higher. It turns out that marshes themselves actually do a really good job at both buffering waves, so they attenuate waves, and they can actually slow down storm surge. So in many ways, it's marshes and large marsh area that has a much greater effect on protecting these coastal areas than oyster reefs do. So what's then the point of doing oyster restoration? Well, it turns out that these marshes historically existed in a state where many of these marshes were lined by these oyster reefs. Once these oyster reefs were removed, it released bare sediment, and it's actually these kind of typical sort of general wind waves that occur during a daily period that are actually causing a lot of erosion of these marshes. It's this wave attack at the sort of the right elevation that are hitting those marsh edges that are causing a lot of that erosion and attenuation or breakdown of these waves. And so we've actually been monitoring, and so this is a marsh that's in front of Watcher Creek that we've been monitoring through aerial imagery and so forth. So we have over a 40 or a 30-year record of aerial extent of this marsh. And if you actually look at it, this marsh back in 1994 was, 30–40% larger than it is today. We've seen massive amounts of erosion of the shoreline of this marsh. And so a shrinking of these area of the marsh, primarily due to edge erosion caused by these persistent kind of low energy waves that are constantly breaking these down. Why is this occurring? Well, it's what we hypothesize it is that once you remove the oyster reefs, these marshes lose their protective barrier and start to erode at a much faster rate. So the goal of this is to say, well, maybe oyster reefs don't actually offer much coastal protection benefits, but these marshes do. And if we can use the oyster reefs to protect the marshes, then it's these coupled ecosystem dynamics that really impact wave attenuation, storm surge mitigation to a certain extent. Not great, but definitely waves to a certain extent kind of smooths out some of that storm surge. And so what we've been working with is the Nature Conservancy is using these both oyster castles, which I showed before, and these novel different oyster structures. And we're using these called oyster castles, because what we found is in these soft, muddy sediments, when you put an oyster castle, they often just tip over in a wave because the sediments are so soft. These other systems, you can bury into the mud and they suspend above the system and they can grow oysters on them. And so here's an aerial image of one of these oyster catchers. But we built these along the marsh platform. And then we've also built a lot of the traditional oyster castles. And these, right, as you can see in these kind of sort of persistent kind of typical windy days, they're actually do a decent job of buffering the lower marsh platform to prevent sediment erosion, and that prevents sort of the attenuation of some of these marshes over longer periods that then allow these marshes to persist longer, that then can offer coastal protection benefits. So these oyster reefs were built in the last 2 to 3 years, and so this is sort of a new project that we hope to kind of monitor over the next, say, decade to really understand how this is impacting. And similarly, these oyster reefs were built a year ago, and you see this really nice oyster growth on these. And then kind of see here, this newer oyster castles were built, earlier in that season that don't have any oysters on them. But even over just say a 2 to 3 year period, we've seen some pretty dramatic differences in reasons where we haven't built oyster reef. You can kind of see where this pole was in June 2021 versus a year later, you can start to see that pretty big erosion. So we've been using GPS surveys, aerial imageries to really quantify shoreline change rates. And so pre-oyster construction, depending on where you were along this marsh, we were having erosion rates of between 2 meters per year down to maybe about a half meter per year. once we built these oyster reefs, in most areas, it actually slowed down the rate of erosion, but didn't stop it. Some areas we actually saw enhanced erosion. And so this is areas where we're really interested in understanding what these dynamics are. So in many ways, construction of the oyster reefs here has started to slow down the rate. And what we're doing is monitoring what we think is happening is that sediment is, we're still seeing erosion at the top of the marsh, but these oyster reefs are starting to accumulate and deposit sediments behind it with the goal that it's going to start to elongate that marsh edge. Eventually, it's going to build up so that vegetation can start to grow in. But we're also still seeing heightened erosion on this other side, which we're not really sure why, whether it's changes in sort of the wind patterns that's causing waves to come in. And it's also what might be happening on this far right edge that we're seeing still enhanced erosion is that the marsh next to it is also eroding. So if that marsh erodes far enough away, they're going to get more wave energy there. So it might just be that there's higher wave energy hitting these regions over the last couple of years than there was before. So this is where, you know, in many ways, you build these reef systems, you look at the impacts of natural ecosystems on healthy systems, and it might take a decade or two to actually really understand what's happening in these systems. So just to kind of conclude on this section, you know, regarding these nature-based features for coastal protection, right? That what we found is that these marshes, these large aerial extensive marshes, really do act as natural buffers to these waves. And it's the wave attack that's really driving a lot of these marsh edge erosion. But it's really the coupling of these ecosystems, the oysters combined with the marshes, where the oysters protect the marshes and the marshes protect, do a lot more of that wave dampening. It's these interactions, these ecosystem interactions that really are important if we want to use some of these nature-based solutions for coastal protection. So